Welcome back to the world behind midnight, the channel where the darkest truths hide just past the edge of the light. Tonight's story comes from someone who swore he'd never speak. He's speaking now. I spent 12 years doing things governments deny ever happened. Black ops, ghost missions. But the operation that broke me wasn't in a war zone. It was in a forest. And what we pulled out of that forest was never supposed to exist. They call me Nash. That's not my name, but it'll do. I spent over a decade as a Navy SEAL. Then moved into a specialized interagency unit, so classified it doesn't appear on any organizational chart you'll ever find. We handled anomalies. Things that didn't fit inside the neat boxes of official military doctrine. Things the public wasn't ready to hear about. Most of those things were human. Most of them. The mission that ended my career, and nearly my sanity, was different. This one wasn't about enemy combatants or weapons caches. This one was about something the government had been quietly tracking for years in a remote section of the Pacific Northwest. Something massive, bipedal, and terrifyingly intelligent. I was briefed alongside 3 other operators in a nondescript conference room somewhere in Virginia. No windows, no unit insignia on the walls. Just a projector, a map, and a senior official whose name I never caught. The target was described as a large, unclassified biological entity displaying unprecedented cognitive behavior. They wanted it alive. They wanted it intact. They wanted it yesterday. The grid coordinates pointed to an area so remote that even satellite imagery was patchy, filtered through perpetual cloud cover and an almost impenetrable forest canopy. The Pacific Northwest has places like that. Places where the wilderness simply swallows everything and gives nothing back. My team was lean and lethal. Esteban Moro, former SAS hour tracker and reconnaissance specialist, a man who could read a landscape the way most people read a newspaper. Peyton Lowry, ex-Delta Force, communications and tech. He could keep a signal alive through a mountain and a hurricane simultaneously. Phoenix Henry, Marine Force Recon, our medic and heavy weapons operator, a quiet man who said everything with his eyes and nothing with his mouth. Each of us had seen things that redefined the word dangerous. None of us believed in fairy tales. All of us needed the money they were offering. We didn't ask too many questions. We flew in aboard a heavy-lift Black Hawk under cover of pre-dawn fog so thick it felt like flying through wet concrete. The drop was hard and fast, boots hitting the damp forest floor before full light. The instant we were down, the atmosphere hit us like a physical force. Not cold, not darkness, silence. A silence so complete it felt artificial, engineered by something unseen. Esteban was the first to say it quietly, almost to himself. No birds, not a single one. Even the insects were absent, and this was prime season for them. The forest had been evacuated by everything that breathed. Everything, it seemed, except us, and whatever had cleared the place out. We established a perimeter within the first hour, and spent 3 full days running deep reconnaissance patrols through some of the most hostile terrain I've ever crossed. Sheer rocky inclines, downed timber the size of small buildings, undergrowth so dense it grabbed your kit and held on. On the first afternoon, Esteban brought us to a creek bed and crouched without a word, pointing at the bank. The prints were enormous, 18 inches long, minimum. 5 distinct toe impressions pressed deep into the mud with a heel strike, so pronounced it told you immediately. This thing walked upright. The stride length between prints was nearly 6 feet. Not running, walking calmly. Whatever had made those tracks wasn't fleeing anything. It owned this forest. That first night confirmed we weren't alone in any comfortable sense. We'd established a small camp in a clearing. Motion sensors deployed in a wide circle. Fire kept deliberately low. Around midnight, Peyton's acoustic console began registering something rhythmic and deliberate. A low, deep, thumping sound originating from the trees surrounding us. Thump, 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 pause, thump it. Had the cadence of communication, not aggression. Coordinated, intentional. We raised our weapons and swept the darkness with our lights, and saw absolutely nothing. The moment we moved, it stopped. When we settled, It resumed from a completely different direction. Esteban whispered what we were all already thinking. It knew exactly where we were. It was playing with us. The thumping eventually gave way to something worse. Breathing. Heavy. Slow. Enormous. Close enough that we could hear the rhythm of massive lungs filling and emptying just beyond the edge of the firelight. We tracked the sound as it moved in a slow, deliberate circle around our camp. Not rushing. Not threatening directly. Just announcing its presence. Making it absolutely clear that we were inside something else's home. Phoenix kept his rifle trained on the darkest patch of tree line, jaws set, breathing controlled. None of us slept that night. At first light we found the evidence. Around our camp, pressed deep into the soft earth, were dozens of those same massive tracks. Some of them came within inches of the guy wires of our tents. One set walked straight up to Phoenix's tent entrance and stopped. The clear imprint of a heel and 5 toes sunk 2 inches into the mud right where his head would have been while he slept. Nothing had been touched. Nothing taken. That was the point. The message wasn't violence. It was dominance. We know you're here. We watched you sleep. We chose not to act. That restraint was more frightening than any attack could have been. Command's response was predictable. Press forward. Acquisition remains priority 1. So we moved deeper, using Esteban's tracking to follow a network of prints that grew more numerous the further we went. The forest changed around us as we advanced, growing denser and stranger. Trees twisted and bent in ways that felt almost deliberate, as if the terrain itself was designed to disorient. On the second afternoon of our push, we found their structures. Not caves, not random debris. Architecture. Massive branches, 6 inches in diameter, bent and woven into archways and shelters, with a precision that required both extraordinary physical strength and a clear conceptual vision. Territorial markers, camouflage, things built with purpose by minds that understood purpose. Phoenix found a clearing where smooth river stones had been arranged in a perfect spiral. Dozens of stones placed with obvious intention in a pattern that had no biological explanation. I crouched over it for a long moment and felt something inside my professional certainty begin to crack. This wasn't an animal. This was a people. A civilization hidden inside the wilderness, ancient and aware, watching the modern world through the trees with eyes that missed nothing. The air in that clearing was heavy with a thick, musky scent, unlike anything I'd encountered. Not bear, not wolf, not anything in my catalog of experience. It was the scent of something that had been here since long before we had a word for wilderness. We located the primary entrance to the lava tube system just before dusk, a narrow vertical fissure behind a curtain of ancient rhododendron, nearly invisible unless you already knew to look. The ground around it was covered in tracks of varying sizes, large, medium, smaller ones alongside, a family group, a social unit. Esteban counted at least 6 distinct sets of prints entering and exiting recently. This was home. We had perhaps 90 minutes before they returned for the night. We moved fast. The Kevlar-reinforced capture net was deployed around the entrance with compression charge firing mechanisms anchored to the surrounding rock. Tranquilizer rifles loaded, enough sedative to floor a full-grown white rhino, twice over. Esteban and Peyton held the net trigger and extraction equipment in concealed positions to either side. Phoenix and I took the high ground on the outcrop above, our darts lined up, ready. We used a synthetic scent lure sprayed just inside the fissure entrance, a concentrated food attractant designed specifically for this operation. Then we waited. The waiting was a particular kind of torture. The forest was silent. Our own breathing sounded enormous in the stillness. Then, from deep inside the earth beneath us, came a sound. A low, rhythmic clicking like stone, tapping stone, followed by that deep, guttural respiration we recognized from the night it circled our camp. It was moving toward the entrance. The bait had worked. A massive figure stepped out of the fissure and into the last orange light of the fading sun. 9 feet tall at minimum, shoulders that seemed to span the entrance of the cave. Thick dark brown hair covering everything, moving with the slow, cautious grace of something accustomed to being at the top of every food chain it has ever encountered. Its face stopped me cold. There was intelligence there, clear, ancient, evaluating. It stood still for a long moment, scanning the tree line, nostrils flaring. It knew something was wrong. It just hadn't yet identified what. I gave the signal the moment it reached the lure. Peyton hit the trigger. The compressed charge blasted the net outward, and the Kevlar mesh enveloped the creature completely. For 1 second, the forest was absolutely silent, and then it screamed. A sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. Not an animal's pain cry. Something deeper. Something sentient. A sound of fury, of betrayal, of an intelligence that understood exactly what had just been done to it. Phoenix and I fired simultaneously. 2 heavy-caliber tranquilizer darts hit chest and shoulder. The creature fought the sedation with terrifying power, thrashing against the Kevlar mesh, the anchors pulling partially free from the rock. For nearly a full minute, it was touch and go, the net stretching, the anchor bolts groaning. Then the sedative found its grip. The thrashing slowed, the screaming became a low, agonized moan. The massive figure collapsed, still conscious but diminishing, enormous chest heaving against the net with less and less force. We descended immediately from the outcrop, knowing we had minutes at most. Up close, the scale of the creature redefined everything. Its hands alone were the size of my torso, the fingers thick and calloused, with full opposable thumbs, hands built for both brute force and fine manipulation. Its muscle mass was extraordinary, the kind of density you don't see in any recognized primate. But it was the eyes that made all of us pause, even in the urgency of the moment. Dark, deep-set, fully conscious despite the sedative flooding its system, and fixed on each of us in turn, with an expression of such clear, concentrated hatred and comprehension that it felt like being read, not looked at. Read. This was a captured warrior watching his captors with the patience of something that intended to outlast them. We got the titanium restraints secured and began rigging the extraction sled. We had perhaps 4 minutes of silence before the forest answered. It started as distant vocalizations, the same mournful, raging calls we'd heard on our first night, but rapidly multiplying and converging. Esteban was already on the radio, calling for emergency extraction, before I could give the order. The sounds were everywhere now, not just from the tree line, but from above, from the rocks behind us, from positions that told us we'd been surrounded before we'd even recognized the net was closing. They were coordinating with the same tactical intelligence we used ourselves. They had outmaneuvered us even as we thought we'd won. The first stone hit the rock face 2 feet from Peyton's head, with a crack like a gunshot. Then another. Then a volley. They weren't throwing blind. They were targeting based on our movements, adjusting trajectories with each repositioning we made, using the noise of the impacts to mask their own advance through the undergrowth. Esteban's helmet was ripped clean off by a low-trajectory rock that clipped the tree beside him. The intelligence behind the assault was not the terrifying part. The terrifying part was the emotion driving it. This wasn't territorial instinct. This was grief-fueled war. We dragged the unconscious asset, all 700 pounds of him, to the shelter of the fissure entrance, hoping the narrow passage would bottleneck any physical charge. For 20 minutes we held the position, firing live rounds high into the canopy, not to hit them, but to create noise and disruption, while Esteban hammered the radio for extraction confirmation. The replies were fragmentary, the mountain and the canopy eating the signal. We were alone. Phoenix kept injecting the asset with additional tranquilizer doses every 15 minutes, his hands steady even while his face was chalk white. The asset's eyes kept opening between doses, finding mine every single time. That look didn't change. It was a promise. Extraction confirmation finally broke through the static. A Black Hawk would attempt a landing in a fire-scorched clearing 2 miles out. 45 minutes. We had no choice. We rigged the asset to the heavy-duty emergency sled and began hauling through 2 miles of terrain that seemed to actively resist our progress. They followed us the entire way, staying parallel, never fully visible, never stopping. Their vocalizations echoed through the trees in a continuous, agonized chorus calls that shifted from rage to something closer to grief the further we dragged their family member from his home. They hurled rocks, They hammered the trees in thunderous rhythms that sounded like signals. They howled, but they didn't stop us. Not yet, and that calculated restraint felt like a decision, not a limitation. We broke out of the tree line with 30 seconds to spare before the Blackhawk appeared over the ridge, descending into the ash-filled clearing with its rotors throwing up a storm of debris. The loadmaster began hooking the sled for the hoist. I turned and looked back at the tree line. They were there, all of them, standing at the forest's edge in full view for the first time. A group of figures, different heights, different sizes, watching us with absolute stillness. The largest female stepped forward slightly, her dark eyes fixed on the sled, on the massive, motionless form of the male they'd lost. The sound she made was not rage. It was not a threat. It was grief, raw and absolute. A sound so laden with sorrow that Esteban turned away, and Phoenix stopped moving entirely for a full 3 seconds. We lifted off. The acid, barely conscious, turned his massive head as the helicopter rose. His eyes found mine through the open bay door and held them as the ground fell away. In that look was no animal blankness, no confusion, only the ancient cold knowledge of what had been taken from him, and the absolute certainty of a reckoning that would come in its own time. I turned away first. I've never fully admitted that before. The creature outstared a Navy SEAL, and I understood why. Mission accomplished. Asset delivered to an underground facility I was never given coordinates for. White coats. Reinforced containment. Immediate invasive assessment protocol. We collected our payments enough to retire comfortably. All 4 of us. None of us felt comfortable. Esteban submitted his resignation 3 weeks later, without explanation, forwarding address unknown. Peyton went quiet, responding to messages with single words, and then not at all. Phoenix and I stayed active, but something had shifted in the architecture of daily life. Every sound at the perimeter of awareness felt loaded. Every unfamiliar shape and peripheral vision required deliberate, conscious dismissal. I transferred to a compound in the New Mexico desert, convincing myself that open terrain and ocean-level visibility would neutralize any residual threat. No forest, no canopy, no shadows between ancient trees. Wide, sunlit, exposed desert. Safe. 3 months later, a package arrived at the compound's mail intake. No return address. My name typed crudely on the label. Inside, on a bed of dried forest moss, was a single smooth river stone, the kind found in Pacific Northwest creek beds, round and dark and cold, arranged in a perfect spiral. I knew exactly what it was and exactly who had sent it. They had crossed 1,000 miles of mountain and desert, passed through multiple layers of government security, and placed that stone where it would find me. The message required no translation. We know where you are. The next 6 months were a controlled descent into high-functioning paranoia. I rebuilt my entire security architecture from scratch. Motion sensors, infrared cameras covering every angle of approach, perimeter alarms calibrated to detect pressure above a certain weight threshold. I slept in 2-hour rotations, one eye always partially open. The fear was not irrational. That's what made it so heavy. It wasn't anxiety. It was threat assessment, and the threat was real. I knew what they were capable of. I had watched them coordinate a tactical ambush in real time. I had watched the largest one outthink our net rig before he stepped into it. I had watched an entire family mobilize within minutes and sustain a coordinated assault against 4 armed special operations veterans. Then I found the gouge scored into the aluminum siding of the compound's generator shed, roughly 8 feet off the ground. Deep parallel furrows, impossible width, pressed into the metal with a force that had slightly crumpled the surface around each mark. A bear leaves claw marks at 4 feet, a mountain lion at 3. Whatever made these marks stood well above 8 feet and raked the metal with a casual, demonstrative force, choosing to mark it rather than tear it open, which it clearly could have done. The message was architectural. We were close enough to shut off your power. We didn't. Not yet. I resigned my commission the following week, liquidated everything traceable, changed my name and documentation, drove to the coast of Maine, and took a ferry to a small island of granite and salt wind and very little else. 40 permanent residents. 1 ferry route. Open ocean in every direction. I told myself the water was the final barrier, the definitive end of the trail. No forest, no terrain for concealment, nothing but cold Atlantic and gray rock. 6 weeks after arriving, during a nor'easter that had shut the ferry service down for 4 days, I found something tucked beneath the line of a lobster buoy, tied to my dock. A smooth river stone, round and dark and Pacific Northwest cold, wrapped in a single coarse strand of dark hair. I sat with that stone in my hands for a long time, listening to the storm tear at the roof of my cottage, and understood something completely and permanently. There is no barrier, there is no distance. There is no facility or documentation or ocean wide enough to constitute safety once you have made an enemy of something this ancient, this patient, and this intelligent. We walked into their forest with tranquilizer guns and Kevlar nets and the full weight of government sanction behind us, and we captured one of their own. We called it a mission. They called it something else entirely, and they have the time, the capability, and the motivation to ensure the accounting is settled on their terms and their timeline. I don't write this as a confession. I write it because I think people should understand what actually lives in those unmapped green spaces. On the edge of our maps, what the government has been quietly documenting for decades under classification levels most senior. Officials never reach. Bigfoot. That word makes people laugh. It's designed to. A ridiculous name attached to a ridiculous myth keeps the real thing safely in the realm of campfire stories and late-night entertainment. But I was in that forest. I saw the architecture. I crouched over that spiral of river stones and felt the weight of a civilization pressing back against me from the trees. I watched a family mobilize with tactical precision and grieve with human-level sorrow. I looked into the eyes of a captured being and recognized something looking back. They are not animals. They are not myth. They are a people, ancient, hidden, and fully aware of us in ways we have never been aware of them. And now, because of what my team did in those lava tube hills in the Pacific Northwest, at least 4 of them are fully aware of 4 specific human beings who took something irreplaceable from their family. Charles is gone. Esteban. Untraciable. Peyton. Silent. And me. I am still here, still watching the perimeter, still waking at 2-hour intervals to check the cameras, still carrying the weight of that look from the helicopter bay door, the captured warrior's eyes, the grieving female's cry, the stone on the moss, the stone in the hair, the gouges in the metal. I used to believe that military training gave you a framework for every conceivable threat. A response protocol for every scenario. I know now that's a kind of arrogance, a species-level arrogance that assumes human intelligence sits at the top of every pyramid it enters. We entered a pyramid that was already occupied, had been occupied for longer than our civilization has existed, and we pulled the apex from it by force, and the pyramid remembers. Every shadow at the edge of my vision, every sound the wind makes against the cottage walls at night. Every morning I wake up to find nothing on the perimeter. I know that means nothing. It means they chose not to act yet. The distinction between not yet and never is the thing I live inside now. That is my life. Not retired, not at peace, vigilant, because somewhere in the deep wild of this continent, a massive, dark-eyed, impossibly intelligent being is moving through the darkness with quiet purpose. And somewhere on its route is a small granite island off the coast of Maine, and a man who took something it loved, and who has never stopped paying for that decision since the moment the helicopter left the ground. If you're still listening to this in the dark right now, then you already know the feeling. That certainty that something, somewhere, hasn't forgotten you. Stay with the world behind midnight. Subscribe before the silence finds you. Another story is already waiting, just past the edge of the light.